Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 4 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 4. Question number 120. An S3 object created notification should invoke a Lambda function that publishes an SNS message for objects larger than 50 megabytes. Direct CLI tests of the function succeed, but uploading a 3 gigabytes object does not invoke it. Which condition could explain the failure? Option A. S3 cannot invoke Lambda directly from object-created notifications. Option B. S3 notifications stop working when an object exceeds 1 gigabytes. Option C. The bucket must allow anonymous public access before it can invoke Lambda. Option D. The Lambda resource-based policy does not permit the S3 service to invoke the function. The correct answer is D. The Lambda resource-based policy does not permit the S3 service to invoke the function. Here is why. S3 requires Lambda invoke function permission in the function's resource-based policy before an object-created notification can invoke the function. Why are the other options not correct? A. S3 event notifications can invoke Lambda directly. B. A 3 gigabytes object is within S3 object limits and does not disable object-created notifications. C. Public bucket access is neither required nor appropriate for service invocation. Exam tip. Event sources that push directly to Lambda need permission in the function's resource-based policy. Question number 121. An internal portal authenticates employees before allowing them to share selected objects from a private Amazon S3 bucket. The bucket must remain non-public and each approved recipient should receive temporary access to only the requested object. Which AWS feature should the application use for the download access? Option A. An S3 bucket policy that grants broad read access to authenticated users. Option B. An Amazon Cognito identity pool that permanently exposes the object. Option C. An S3 pre-signed URL generated after the application authorizes the request. Option D. An Amazon Cognito user pool used as the object delivery mechanism. The correct answer is C. An S3 pre-signed URL generated after the application authorizes the request. Here is why. A pre-signed URL grants time-limited access to one private S3 object by using the permissions of the principal that signs the request. Why are the other options not correct? A. A broad bucket policy can expose more objects or principals than necessary. B. An identity pool can provide temporary AWS credentials, but is not the direct single-object sharing mechanism. D. A user pool authenticates users, but does not itself authorize an S3 object download. Exam tip. Authenticate the user first, then issue a short-lived S3 pre-signed URL for the specific authorized object. Question number 122. A team is building a low-traffic proof-of-concept API that returns weather data for one office. Clients need a REST endpoint, and the solution should use managed API caching where appropriate while minimizing cost and infrastructure administration. Which implementation best meets these requirements? Option A. Deploy a microservices application to Elastic Beanstalk and expose it through an application load balancer. Option B. Run a containerized service on Amazon EK South and place API gateway in front of it. Option C. Define a Lambda function with AWS SAM and expose it through an API gateway REST API. Option D. Run the container on Amazon EC South and place API gateway in front of the service. The correct answer is C. Define a Lambda function with AWS SAM and expose it through an API gateway REST API. Here is why. Lambda and API gateway are serverless and usage-based, making them cost-effective for a low-traffic proof of concept. API gateway REST APIs also provide managed caching. Why are the other options not correct? A. Elastic Beanstalk and an ALB maintain provision compute for a small test workload. B. EKS adds cluster management and continuous infrastructure cost. D. ECS requires more container infrastructure than the simple workload needs. Exam tip. For intermittent lightweight APIs, API gateway and Lambda minimize idle cost and operational management. Question number 123. A production API gateway API invokes a Lambda alias that points to the current production version. A developer has published an updated function version and wants other developers to test it through API gateway without sending any customer traffic to the new code. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Add the new version to the production alias with a 10% routing weight and test through the production stage. Option B. Create a separate API gateway API and integrate it with the new function version. Option C. Insert a routing Lambda function that identifies test requests and invokes one of two function versions. Option D. Create a new API gateway stage whose integration targets the new published Lambda version. The correct answer is D. Create a new API gateway stage whose integration targets the new published Lambda version. Here is why. A separate stage creates an isolated test endpoint and can invoke the new immutable version without modifying customer traffic through the production stage. Why are the other options not correct? A. A weighted production alias intentionally sends some customer requests to the new code. B. A second API duplicates configuration and adds more management than another stage. C. A routing function adds code, latency, and another production integration. Exam tip. Use published Lambda versions and separate API gateway stages to test changes without affecting production traffic. Question number 124. Application code running on EC2 must call putObject to upload files to a specific S3 bucket. The instances obtain temporary credentials from an attached instance profile. Which policy should the developer update to grant the application this permission? Option A. The VPC endpoint policy, regardless of whether the application uses an endpoint. Option B. A session policy manually attached to each EC2 role session. Option C. The identity-based IAM policy attached to the instance profile role. Option D. A KMS key policy attached to the instance profile role. The correct answer is C. The identity-based IAM policy attached to the instance profile role. Here is why. Applications on EC2 receive role credentials from the instance profile, so the role policy must permit S3 putObject on the required object resources. Why are the other options not correct? A. An endpoint policy can further restrict endpoint traffic, but does not replace the role's required permission. B. EC2 applications normally use the role's permissions without a separately supplied session policy. D. A KMS key policy controls KMS use, not ordinary S3 putObject authorization. Exam tip. Grant EC2 applications AWS permissions through the IAM role in the instance profile. Question number 125. Development and production S3 buckets exist in one account. An incorrect notification. Configuration allowed the development bucket to invoke the production image processing Lambda function. The team must ensure that only the production bucket can invoke that function, following least privilege. Which change meets the requirement? Option A. Restrict the production function's execution role so it can read only the production bucket. Option B. Add a resource-based policy to the production function that permits invocation only from the production bucket ARN. Option C. Separate the environments into accounts and allow every S3 bucket in each account to invoke that account's functions. Option D. Separate the environments into accounts and change only the function's execution role. Read permissions. The correct answer is B. Add a resource-based policy to the production function that permits invocation only from the production bucket ARN. Here is why. Lambda's resource-based policy controls which S3 resource can invoke the function. Restricting AWS source ARN to the production bucket enforces least privilege. Why are the other options not correct? A. The execution role controls what the function can access after invocation, not who can invoke it. C. Account separation is useful, but allowing every same account bucket is broader than the named production source. D. Read permissions do not restrict invocation. Exam tip. Use a Lambda resource policy for invoke permission and the execution role for the function's downstream AWS calls. Question number 126. A developer is deploying a new application build to a disposable elastic beanstalk test environment. Temporary downtime is acceptable, and the main objective is to complete the deployment as quickly as possible. Which deployment policy should the developer choose? Option A, all at once. Option B, rolling with additional batch. Option C, immutable. Option D, rolling. The correct answer is A, all at once. Here is why. All-at-once deployment updates every instance simultaneously, producing the shortest deployment duration when downtime is acceptable. Why are the other options not correct? B, rolling with additional batch launches extra instances and updates in batches. C, immutable creates a replacement fleet before traffic changes. D, rolling updates sequential batches and takes longer. Exam tip. All at once is fastest, but causes downtime. Use safer rolling or immutable strategies for production workloads. Question number 127. An S3 triggered Lambda function runs in a VPC and creates analysis files. Multiple Lambda functions, other AWS workloads, and on-premises systems must access the files. All producers must also append entries to one shared log file. Which storage solution supports these file system requirements? Option A, store the files in each function/TMP directory. Option B, attach an EBS multi-attach volume directly to all Lambda functions. Option C, write the files under /opt in each Lambda execution environment. Option D, mount an Amazon EFS file system in the Lambda functions and store the results and shared log on the mount. The correct answer is D, mount an Amazon EFS file system in the Lambda functions and store the results and shared log on the mount. Here is why. EFS provides shared, persistent, NFS-compatible file storage that VPC-enabled Lambda functions and other authorized systems can access and modify. Why are the other options not correct? A/TMP is isolated, ephemeral storage for one execution environment. B, EBS volumes cannot be directly attached to Lambda functions. C/opt contains function layers and is not a shared writable file system. Exam tip. Use EFS when Lambda requires persistent shared file semantics. Use /TMP only for execution local scratch data. Question number 128. An on-premises source control system sends one webhook to an API gateway endpoint in a central AWS account. The API publishes deployment events to EventBridge. The same events must be delivered to event buses in several other AWS accounts without adding more webhooks. Which design meets the requirement? Option A, grant the central account permission to put events on event buses in the receiver accounts and add those event buses as targets of the existing EventBridge rule. Option B, deploy the API in every receiver account and assign the same custom domain to all APIs. Option C, create a separate source control webhook for an API in each receiving account. Option D, replace the REST API with an HTTP API, but leave the event routing unchanged. The correct answer is A, grant the central account permission to put events on event buses in the receiver accounts and add those event buses as targets of the existing EventBridge rule. Here is why. Cross-account event bus targets fan out the central event stream without changing the original webhook. Receiver bus policies authorize the central account. Why are the other options not correct? B, one custom domain cannot direct the same request simultaneously to APIs in several accounts. C, multiple webhooks violate the requirement to leave the SCM configuration unchanged. D, changing API type does not create cross-account event delivery. Exam tip. Use EventBridge event bus resource policies and cross-account bus targets for centralized multi-account event routing. Question number 129. A web page already knows the complete primary keys for several records in two DynamoDB tables. The application needs to retrieve all requested records with the fewest network round trips. Which solution is most efficient? Option A, scan both tables and filter the responses by the requested keys. Option B, send one batch get item request that includes the key lists for both tables. Option C, send one batch get item request for each table separately. Option D, create an LSI on one table and issue a separate query for every requested partition. Key. The correct answer is B. Send one batch get item request that includes the key lists for both tables. Here is why. Batch get item accepts keys for multiple tables in one request, reducing network round trips while retrieving specific items by complete primary key. Why are the other options not correct? A. Scans read unrelated items and consume more capacity. C. Separate batch get item calls create an additional network round trip. D. The proposed index and multiple queries are unnecessary when all item keys are known. Exam tip. Batch get item can retrieve known keys from multiple Dynamo DB tables in one API request. Question number 130. An API gateway application has separate development, test, and production Lambda functions. The company wants isolated API endpoints for each environment without adding environment selection logic to clients or combining all code paths in one function. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Use one API stage and require clients to send an environment query parameter. Option B. Use multiple stages, but route all stages to one function that branches on environment variables. Option C. Use one stage and branch inside one function according to a client-supplied parameter. Option D. Create multiple API gateway stages and use stage variables to select the corresponding environment-specific Lambda function. The correct answer is D. Create multiple API gateway stages and use stage variables to select the corresponding environment-specific Lambda function. Here is why. Stages provide isolated endpoints, and stage variables can supply environment-specific Lambda integration values without client routing logic. Why are the other options not correct? A. Client-selected environments weaken isolation and expose routing decisions externally. B. One function with multiple environment code paths increases coupling. C. It combines both client-controlled routing and environment branching in one function. Exam tip. Use API gateway stages and stage variables to separate development, test, and production integrations. Question number 131. A Lambda handler consumes SQS event payloads. The team wants fast unit tests in its CI/CD workflow without provisioning queues or invoking a deployed function. How should the handler be tested? Option A. Deploy a CloudFormation stack containing a queue and function, then invoke the deployed function. Option B. Create a real test queue and have the unit test receive messages from the service. Option C. Construct a representative SQS event fixture and invoke the handler directly during the unit test stage. Option D. Use AWS Lambda invoke against a deployed function with a test payload. The correct answer is C. Construct a representative SQS event fixture and invoke the handler directly during the unit test stage. Here is why. A unit test supplies a representative event object to the handler and mocks external dependencies, avoiding deployed resources and network calls. Why are the other options not correct? A. Deploying a stack and invoking Lambda is an integration test. B. Receiving from a real SQS test service integration rather than only the unit. D. AWS Lambda invoke calls a deployed function. Exam tip. Unit test Lambda handlers locally with representative event fixtures and mocked AWS SDK dependencies. Question number 132. Front-end developers need to test success and failure responses from an API gateway REST API before the Lambda backend is implemented. One API method should return different predefined HTTP status codes and response bodies based on the test request. Which solution requires the least effort? Option A. Create separate API resources for successful and unsuccessful mock responses. Option B. Configure one API gateway mock integration and use request and response mapping logic to select the required status code and body. Option C. Create multiple Lambda functions that return fixed responses and integrate them with the API methods. Option D. Configure a mock integration that invokes a Lambda function to determine the response. The The correct answer is B. Configure one API gateway mock integration and use request and response mapping logic to select the required status code and body. Here is why. A mock integration generates configurable API responses without a backend, and mapping templates can select success or error responses from the request. Why are the other options not correct? A. Separate resources duplicate API configuration unnecessarily. C. Lambda functions add code, deployments, and invocation overhead. D. A mock integration does not invoke Lambda. Exam tip. Use API gateway mock integrations to test front-end behavior before a backend is available. Question number 133. A code build project runs database integration tests from a build spec file. Database. Credentials must be available to the build without appearing as plain text in the build spec, and company policy requires automatic rotation. Which configuration is most secure? Option A. Put the plaintext connection string in a code build environment variable and rotate it with event bridge. Option B. Hardcode the credentials in buildspec.yml and use a lambda rotation function. Option C. Reference a parameter store secure string from a code build environment variable and configure native automatic database password rotation in parameter store. Option D. Reference an AWS Secrets Manager secret from a code build environment variable and enable automatic rotation for the secret. The correct answer is D. Reference an AWS Secrets Manager secret from a code build environment variable and enable automatic rotation for the secret. Here is why. Code build can resolve a secrets manager-backed environment variable at runtime, avoiding plaintext in the build spec while secrets manager handles rotation. Why are the other options not correct? A. Plaintext environment variables expose the connection string. B. Hard-coding credentials in buildspec.yml exposes secrets in source. C. Parameter store secure string protects values but does not provide the stated managed database credential rotation. Exam tip. Use code build secrets_manager environment variables for rotating database credentials. Question number 134. Several Lambda functions connect to the same RDS database. Security policy requires the database password to change automatically every 30 days and remain centrally available to the functions. Which solution is most secure? Option A. Store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and configure a 30-day rotation schedule. Option B. Store the password in each function's environment variables and redeploy monthly. Option C. Store the credentials as parameter store secure string parameters and assume they have native database rotation. Option D. Store the credentials in an SSEC encrypted S3 object and rotate only the customer provided encryption key. The correct answer is A. Store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and configure a 30-day rotation schedule. Here is why. Secrets Manager centrally encrypts database credentials and supports automatic rotation that all authorized Lambda functions can retrieve. Why are the other options not correct? B. Environment variables require repeated configuration updates and redeployments. C. Parameter store does not provide the stated managed database password rotation. D. Rotating the SC key does not rotate the database password and requires custom key management. Exam tip. Select Secrets Manager when managed rotation of database credentials is required. Question number 135. Code Deploy will release a new Lambda version behind API Gateway. The rollout must expose only a small portion of users to possible defects, avoid downtime, and complete faster than a deployment that shifts 10% of traffic every minute. Which configuration meets the requirements? Option A. Shift all traffic immediately with an all-at-once Lambda deployment. Option B. Use an in-place deployment and switch all requests after deployment. Option C. Use a predefined canary deployment that sends 10% of traffic immediately and the remaining traffic after 5 minutes. Option D. Use a linear deployment that shifts 10% of traffic every minute. The correct answer is C. Use a predefined canary deployment that sends 10% of traffic immediately and the remaining traffic after 5 minutes. Here is why. The canary limits initial user exposure, preserves availability through lambda alias traffic shifting, and completes in 5 minutes. Why are the other options not correct? A. All at once minimizes time but exposes every user to potential defects. B. In place is not the lambda traffic shifting deployment model. D. Moving 10% each minute takes longer to complete. Exam tip. Canary releases minimize initial exposure. Linear releases increase traffic in repeated increments. Question number 136. An application configuration value must expire at a specified time. The team also needs an event before expiration and wants to avoid custom cleanup or notification code. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Use a standard parameter store parameter and assign expiration and expiration notification policies. Option B. Use an advanced parameter store parameter with expiration and expiration notification policies. Option C. Use a standard parameter and schedule a Lambda function to delete it and publish SNS messages. Option D. Use an advanced parameter and run an EC2 cron job for expiration and notifications. The correct answer is B. Use an advanced parameter store parameter with expiration and expiration notification policies. Here is why. Parameter policies are supported for advanced parameters and natively provide expiration and pre-expiration events without custom compute. Why are the other options not correct? A. Standard parameters do not support parameter policies. C. The Lambda workflow adds custom scheduling and notification code. D. An EC2 cron job creates unnecessary server operations. Exam tip. Parameter store expiration policies require the advanced parameter tier. Question number 137. After a Lambda function is attached to private VPC subnets, its calls to public internet APIs fail. The security group and network ACL retain their default outbound behavior, and an internet gateway is attached to the VPC. What networking change restores outbound internet access? Option A. Route private subnet internet traffic through a NAT gateway located in a public subnet. Option B. Add a second internet gateway and route the private subnet directly to it. Option C. Add another outbound allow rule to the default security group. Option D. Add another outbound allow entry to the default network ACL. The correct answer is A. Route private subnet internet traffic through a NAT gateway located in a public subnet. Here is why. A VPC-attached Lambda function in a private subnet needs a route to a public NAT gateway, which then uses the internet gateway for outbound internet access. Why are the other options not correct? B. Resources in a private subnet cannot obtain internet access by routing directly to an internet gateway. C. The default security group already allows outbound traffic. D. The default network ACL already permits the required outbound and return traffic. Exam tip. A Lambda function in private subnets reaches the internet through NAT, not directly through an internet gateway. Question number 138. A developer is creating an application for a company. The application needs to read the file doc.txt that is placed in the root folder of an Amazon S3 bucket that is named DOC example bucket. The company's security team requires the principle of least privilege to be applied to the application's IAM policy. Which IAM policy statement will meet these security requirements? Action. S3. Get object. Option A. L. Effect allow. Resource ARN. AWS. S3. DOC example bucket / doc.txt. Action. INGBIC. Option B. 1. Effect allow. Resource *. Action. S3. Get object. Option C. I. Effect allow. Resource ARN. AWS. S3. DOC example bucket / Action. No 3ic. Option D. Effect allow. Resource ARN. AWS. S3. DOC example bucket / doc.txt. The correct answer is A. Allow S3. Get object on ARN. AWS. S3. DOC example bucket / doc.txt. Here is why. The application needs only one operation, S3, get object, on one specific S3 object. Option A restricts both the action and resource to exactly what the application requires, satisfying least privilege. S3 object operations must reference an object ARN in the policy's resource element. Why are the other options not correct? B. Grants every S3 action on every S3 resource, which is excessively broad. C. Grants getObject for every object in the bucket, not only doc.txt. D. Restricts the resource to doc.txt but grants all S3 actions on that object. Exam tip. Least privilege means restricting both the IAM action and resource to the minimum required operation and exact object ARN. Question number 139. A feature branch in a code commit Git repository has fallen behind the main branch and now contains merge conflicts. The developer wants to incorporate the latest main branch. Commits while keeping the existing feature work with minimal rework. Which action should the developer take? Option A. Clone the repository again and manually recreate the feature branch. Option B. Create another branch and copy every changed file from the old branch. Option C. Fetch the latest main branch and rebase the feature branch onto it, resolving conflicts during the rebase. Option D. Use commit visualizer only to inspect the commit graph without updating the branch. The correct answer is C. Fetch the latest main branch and rebase the feature branch onto it, resolving conflicts during the rebase. Here is why. Rebasing reapplies the feature commits on top of the current main branch and allows conflicts to be resolved without recreating the work. Why are the other options not correct? A. Recloning and rebuilding the branch duplicates work. B. Copying changes to a new branch is manual and error-prone. D. Commit visualizer helps inspection but does not incorporate or resolve the changes. Exam tip. Use standard git merge or rebase workflows to integrate upstream changes. Visualization alone does not resolve conflicts. Question number 140. A distributed application runs as multiple Amazon ECS services on AWS Fargate. The team needs distributed traces to diagnose request failures across the microservices by using the AWS X-Ray SDK and daemon architecture. Which two configurations are required? Choose two. Option A. Deploy the X-Ray daemon as a Kubernetes daemon set and grant permissions to an ECS service role. Option B. Run the X-Ray daemon as a sidecar container and grant the ECS task role permission to send traces to X-Ray. Option C. Have the application call a non-existent put X-Ray trace operation directly instead of using the daemon. Option D. Instrument the application with the X-Ray SDK and configure it to send trace data to the local X-Ray daemon. E. Grant CloudWatch, pull logs to the task role and treat stout logging as distributed tracing. The correct answer is B. Run the X-Ray daemon as a sidecar container and grant the ECS task role permission to send traces to X-Ray. D. Instrument the application with the X-Ray SDK and configure it to send trace data to the local X-Ray daemon. Here is why. On Fargate, the daemon runs beside the application in the task. Instrumented services send segments to it, and the task role authorizes uploads to X-Ray. Why are the other options not correct? A. Daemon sets are a Kubernetes construct and are not the ECS Fargate pattern. C. The SDK normally sends trace data to the daemon and put X-Ray trace is not the required API. E. Logs are useful, but do not create distributed traces, and CloudWatch. Pull logs is not the required write permission. Exam tip. The legacy X-Ray SDK and daemon pattern uses application instrumentation plus a sidecar. AWS recommends OpenTelemetry for new instrumentation. Question number 141. A developer adds request validation to an existing production API gateway API. The change must first be exercised with external test requests without altering the currently deployed production stage. Which approach requires the least operational overhead? Option A. Update the API configuration, deploy it to a new test stage, validate it, and then deploy the same configuration to the production stage. Option B. Export the API, import it as a second API, test it, and repeat the changes in the original API. Option C. Recreate all resources and methods in a separate API before repeating the changes in production. Option D, clone the API, modify the clone, and then manually reproduce the same changes in the original API. The correct answer is A. Update the API configuration, deploy it to a new test stage, validate it, and then deploy the same configuration to the production stage. Here is why. A new stage provides an isolated endpoint for testing the updated API configuration without duplicating the API or changing the existing production deployment. Why are the other options not correct? B. Exporting and importing another API duplicates configuration and requires repeating the change. C. Rebuilding resources manually creates substantial extra work. D. Cloning also requires maintaining and reproducing changes in two APIs. Exam tip. API gateway stages let one API configuration support isolated deployment environments. Question number 142. An API gateway HTTP API invokes Lambda functions that write partner orders and subsequent updates to DynamoDB. Every persisted change must also be copied to S3 for later analysis, including changes produced by future partner-specific functions. The team wants to avoid modifying every producer. Which solution requires the least development effort? Option A. Add another API endpoint and require every producer function to post a copy of each change. Option B. Require every producer to publish each order to an SNS topic and subscribe an archival function. Option C. Enable DynamoDB streams and invoke an archival Lambda function that writes each stream record to S3. Option D. Require every producer to publish to Kinesis data streams and configure the stream to write directly to S3. The correct answer is C. Enable DynamoDB streams and invoke an archival Lambda function that writes each stream record to S3. Here is why. DynamoDB streams captures item-level changes from every current or future writer, allowing one downstream function to archive the changes without modifying producers. Why are the other options not correct? A. Every producer must call the new endpoint. B. Every producer must be modified to publish to SNS. D. It also requires every producer to publish, and Kinesis data streams does not directly deliver records to S3 without another delivery component. Exam tip. Use DynamoDB streams when downstream processing must observe changes regardless of which application writes the table. Question number 143. Premium files remain private in an S3 bucket. After the application confirms that a user has a paid subscription, it must provide time-limited access to one selected object without changing the bucket to public. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Require MFA in the bucket policy for all object downloads. Option B. Enable server-side encryption and rely on it to distinguish paid users. Option C. Allow anonymous GetObject access through the bucket policy. Option D. Generate a pre-signed URL for the requested object after authorization. The correct answer is D. Generate a pre-signed URL for the requested object after authorization. Here is why. The application can authorize the subscriber and issue a time-limited URL for one private S3 object without changing bucket privacy. Why are the other options not correct? A. MFA does not represent paid subscription authorization for website visitors. B. Encryption protects stored data but does not control which users can download it. C. Anonymous access exposes content to non-paying users. Exam tip. Use short-lived pre-signed URLs to deliver private S3 objects after application level authorization. Question number 144. An existing DynamoDB table uses email address as its partition key. A search endpoint must return contacts for one customer type whose email address begins with a user-entered prefix. The table cannot be recreated. Which change supports efficient query operations? Option A. Add a GSI with email address as the partition key and customer type as the sort key. Option B. Add a GSI with customer type as the partition key and email address as the sort key, then use begins underscore with on the sort key. Option C. Add an LSI with customer type as a new partition key and email address as the sort key. Option D. Add an LSI with job title as the partition key and email address as the sort key. The correct answer is B. Add a GSI with customer type as the partition key and email address as the sort key, then use begins underscore with on the sort key. Here is why. A GSI can be added to an existing table with a different partition key. Query can match one customer type and apply begins underscore with to the email address sort key. Why are the other options not correct? A. Email address as the partition key requires an exact value and cannot support the desired prefix search. C. An LSI must retain the base table's partition key and must be created with the table. D. It has the same LSI limitations and uses the wrong partition key. Exam tip. DynamoDB begins underscore with is a sort key condition. Use a GSI when the access pattern needs a new partition key. Question number 145. A developer uses AWS SAM Accelerate during development. When Lambda source files change, the developer wants the CLI to detect the updates continuously and synchronize changed code to the development stack instead of rebuilding and redeploying every resource manually. Which command provides this workflow? Option A, SAM sync watch. Option B, SAM package. Option C, SAM deploy, no execute change set. Option D, SAM deploy force upload. The correct answer is A, SAM sync watch. Here is why. SAM sync watch monitors local changes and synchronizes updated code resources to the development stack using direct service APIs for fast code updates. Why are the other options not correct? B. SAM package prepares deployment artifacts but does not continuously synchronize changes. C. The option prepares a change set without executing it. D. It forces artifact upload during a normal deployment rather than using SAM Accelerate Watch mode. Exam tip. Use SAM Sync Watch for rapid development stack synchronization, not for production deployment workflows. Question number 146. A CloudFormation custom resource invokes an existing Lambda function that retrieves API credentials from external providers. The function must securely persist the returned credential values with minimal additional infrastructure. Which solution best meets the requirement? Option A. Define a generated secrets manager value that creates unrelated random credentials instead of storing the retrieved values. Option B. Pass the credentials into a CloudFormation parameter and rely on NoEcho as encrypted storage. Option C. Have the custom resource Lambda function call SSM, put parameter with type secure string, and store the retrieved credentials as the parameter value. Option D. Call SSM, put parameter with a non-existent NoEcho setting instead of using secure string. The correct answer is C. Have the custom resource Lambda function call SSM, put parameter with type secure string, and store the retrieved credentials as the parameter value. Here is why. The existing Lambda can securely persist the actual retrieved values as KMS, encrypted secure string parameters without adding another workflow. Why are the other options not correct? A. Generate secret string creates a new random value rather than storing credentials returned by the providers. B. NoEcho masks display of a template parameter but is not secure persistent storage. D. Put parameter has no NoEcho setting. Encryption requires the secure string type. Exam tip. Use parameter store secure string for encrypted configuration values when managed secret rotation is not required. Question number 147. A developer configures the AWS CLI with an IAM user's credentials and runs a valid DynamoDB get item command against a table. The request returns an authorization error. What is the most likely cause? Option A. DynamoDB get item is available only through the REST API. Option B. The IAM user does not have an identity policy that permits read access to the table. Option C. AWS support must activate CLI access for each DynamoDB table. Option D. The request must use put item instead of get item. The correct answer is B. The IAM user does not have an identity policy that permits read access to the table. Here is why. DynamoDB evaluates the caller's IAM permissions, and getItem requires DynamoDB getItem authorization for the target table. Why are the other options not correct? A. DynamoDB is fully accessible through the AWS CLI. C. AWS support does not activate table access for IAM identities. D. Put item writes data and does not retrieve an existing item. Exam tip. When a valid AWS CLI command returns access denied, inspect the caller's IAM policies and the target resource scope. Question number 148. A CloudFront distribution must require encrypted connections from viewers to CloudFront and from CloudFront to a custom web origin. Which two settings meet the requirement? Choose two. Option A. Set the origin protocol policy to HTTPS only. Option B. Configure the origin HTTP port as 443. Option C. Enable restrict viewer access. Option D. Set the viewer protocol policy to HTTPS only or redirect HTTP to HTTPS. E. Use AWS KMS to encrypt the network connection to the origin. The correct answer is A. Set the origin protocol policy to HTTPS only. D. Set the viewer protocol policy to HTTPS only or redirect HTTP to HTTPS. Here is why. The viewer policy enforces HTTPS from users to CloudFront, and the origin policy requires HTTPS from CloudFront to the custom origin. Why are the other options not correct? B. Port 443 alone does not force CloudFront to use HTTPS. C. Restrict viewer access controls signed URLs or cookies, not transport encryption. E. KMS encrypts data and keys at rest. It is not the TLS mechanism for origin traffic. Exam tip. CloudFront uses viewer protocol policy for the client leg and origin protocol policy for the origin leg. Question number 149. A code pipeline workflow deploys a web application to a test environment. Unit tests produce a detailed report and must run automatically before any code revision reaches that environment. A failed test must stop the pipeline with minimal operational work. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Require every developer to install and maintain a local Git pre-commit test hook. Option B. Add Jenkins before deployment and manage a Jenkins file and test report plugin. Option C. Add a code build stage before the test deployment, fail the build when tests fail, and publish the results through code build test reports. Option D. Run code build only after the application has already been deployed to the test environment. The correct answer is C. Add a code build stage before the test deployment, fail the build when tests fail, and publish the results through code build test reports. Here is why. Code build runs the unit tests centrally, blocks deployment on failure, and integrates detailed test reports into the AWS console with minimal infrastructure. Why are the other options not correct? A. Local hooks are not centrally enforced and require maintenance on every workstation. B. Jenkins adds servers, plugins, and operational management. D. Running tests after deployment allows unvalidated code to reach the test environment. Exam tip. Put automated code build test gates before deployment stages and use test reports for structured results. Question number 150. Hundreds of Lambda functions in separate development, test, and production accounts trust a 10 kilobytes private root CA certificate for calls to on-premises HTTPS endpoints. The certificate was packaged with every function and now must be replaced without rebuilding all deployment packages. The replacement should be shared across accounts at minimal cost. Which two actions meet these requirements? Choose two. Option A. Store the certificate as a parameter store secure string even though its size exceeds the maximum advanced parameter value. Option B. Store the certificate in an S3 bucket and use a bucket policy to grant the required cross-account execution roles read access. Option C. Store the certificate in Secrets Manager and grant access to IAM users rather than the Lambda execution roles. Option D. Load and install the certificate inside the handler during every invocation. E. Refactor the functions to download and install the certificate during execution. Environment initialization outside the handler. The correct answer is B. Store the certificate in an S3 bucket and use a bucket policy to grant the required cross-account execution roles read access. E. Refactor the functions to download and install the certificate during execution environment initialization outside the handler. Here is why. S3 cost-effectively stores the 10 kilobytes certificate and supports cross-account resource policies. Loading it outside the handler reuses the initialized trust store across warm invocations. Why are the other options not correct? A. Parameter store advanced values are limited to 8 kilobytes. C. Secrets Manager costs more for a non-secret certificate and permissions should target execution roles, not IAM users. D. Loading inside the handler repeats retrieval and trust store work on every invocation. Exam tip. Externalize shared Lambda configuration and initialize reusable resources outside the handler when updates should not require repackaging. Question number 151. A data ingestion service will encrypt objects before storing them in Amazon S3. The organization requires a customer-controlled AWS KMS key, whose cryptographic material is rotated automatically every year. Which key type satisfies the requirement? Option A. A symmetric customer-managed KMS key, whose key material is generated by AWS KMS. Option B. An asymmetric customer-managed KMS key, whose key material is generated by AWS KMS. Option C. A symmetric customer-managed KMS key with imported key material. Option D. An Amazon S3 managed encryption key. The correct answer is A. A symmetric customer-managed KMS key, whose key material is generated by AWS KMS. Here is why. Automatic KMS key rotation is supported for symmetric customer-managed encryption keys with AWS_KMS origin key material. Why are the other options not correct? B. Asymmetric KMS keys do not support automatic key rotation. C. KMS keys with imported material cannot use automatic rotation. D. S3 managed keys do not provide the requested customer-managed KMS control. Exam tip. KMS automatic rotation requires a symmetric customer-managed key with key material generated by AWS KMS. Question number 152. Several Amazon S3 VPC endpoints exist in one VPC. An S3 bucket must deny requests unless they originate through an S3 endpoint associated with that VPC. The team wants one bucket policy that continues to cover every endpoint in the VPC. Which policy condition is most appropriate? Option A. Use AWS source VEPS with the wildcard value VEPS* in a string not equals condition. Option B. Create a separate bucket policy for every endpoint ID. Option C. Use AWS source VPC with the VPC ID in a string not equals condition. Option D. List every endpoint ID as a separate AWS source VEPS condition in multiple bucket policies. The correct answer is C. Use AWS source VPC with a VPC ID in a string not equals condition. Here is why. AWS source VPC covers requests through any S3 VPC endpoint associated with the specified VPC, avoiding separate endpoint maintenance. Why are the other options not correct? A. A wildcard endpoint value is not a reliable way to restrict requests to named endpoints. B. An S3 bucket has one bucket policy document, not one independently attached policy per endpoint. D. Repeating endpoint-specific policies is unnecessary when every endpoint is in the same VPC. Exam tip. Use AWS source VPC for all endpoints in one VPC. Use AWS source VEPS when a specific endpoint must be identified. Question number 153. A team has accumulated many secrets manager secrets and needs to identify secrets that applications have not retrieved for a defined period. The assessment must not disable any secret or interrupt production workloads. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Temporarily deactivate each secret and monitor application errors. Option B. Configure X-ray sampling rules for calls to get secret value. Option C. Create a CloudWatch alarm directly from CloudTrail log file delivery for every get secret value request. Option D. Enable the AWS config managed rule secrets manager secret unused and use EventBridge to notify the team about non-compliant secrets. The correct answer is D. Enable the AWS config managed rule secrets manager secret and used, and use EventBridge to notify the team about non-compliant secrets. Here is why. The managed rule identifies secrets not accessed within the configured period without disabling them, and EventBridge can route compliance changes to notifications. Why are the other options not correct? A. Disabling secrets can interrupt applications. B. X-ray sampling does not provide an account-level and used secret compliance assessment. C. Cloud Trail records calls, but the proposed alarm does not directly identify secrets and used for a defined period. Exam tip. Use the AWS config secrets manager secret and use rule to detect stale secrets without testing by application failure. Question number 154. A serverless cleanup function must run automatically every 10 minutes without maintaining any compute instances. Which configuration should the developer use? Option A. Create an EventBridge scheduled rule that invokes the Lambda function every 10 minutes. Option B. Set a Lambda environment variable named period to 600. Option C. Create an SNS subscription with a built-in 600-second timer. Option D. Run a cron entry on an EC2 instance that invokes the function. The correct answer is A. Create an EventBridge scheduled rule that invokes the Lambda function every 10 minutes. Here is why. EventBridge schedules invoke Lambda on a recurring cadence without servers or custom polling code. Why are the other options not correct? B. Environment variables do not schedule invocations. C. SNS subscriptions do not include recurring timers. D. EC2 cron requires a continuously managed instance. Exam tip. Use EventBridge scheduler or scheduled rules for recurring serverless invocations. Question number 155. A CloudFormation custom resource invokes Lambda to configure an OpenSearch service domain. The function needs the domain's internal master credentials, but the plaintext credentials must not be stored in the function configuration or exposed in stack outputs. Which design is most secure? Option A. Put the credentials directly in encrypted Lambda environment variables after receiving them as a no-echo stack parameter. Option B. Create a secrets manager secret in CloudFormation, use a dynamic reference for the domain configuration, and let the Lambda execution role retrieve the secret at runtime. Option C. Encrypt the parameter manually with a KMS CLI command and place the ciphertext in a Lambda environment variable. Option D. Store the plaintext value in parameter store and rely only on the CloudFormation no-echo attribute. The correct answer is B. Create a secrets manager secret in CloudFormation, use a dynamic reference for the domain configuration, and let the Lambda execution role retrieve the secret at runtime. Here is why. The dynamic reference avoids embedding plaintext in the template, and Lambda retrieves the encrypted secret only when required through its execution role. Why are the other options not correct? A. No echo masks displays, but environment variables still contain the credential value. C. Custom ciphertext handling adds code and key management complexity. D. No echo is a CloudFormation parameter property, not encrypted parameter store storage. Exam tip. Use Secrets Manager dynamic references for stack resources and runtime get secret value access for application code. Question number 156. A load-balanced web application runs on several interchangeable EC2 instances. Every instance must be able to read and update a user's session regardless of which instance handled the previous request. Where should the application store the session state? Option A. The root file system of each EC2 instance. Option B. EC2 instance store volumes. Option C. Amazon Elastic Cache. Option D. An EBS volume attached independently to each instance. The correct answer is C. Amazon Elastic Cache. Here is why. Elastic Cache provides centralized, low-latency session storage that all load-balanced instances can access. Why are the other options not correct? A. Root file systems are local to each instance. B. Instance stored data is local and ephemeral. D. Independently attached EBS volumes do not create one shared session store across the fleet. Exam tip. Keep scalable web tiers stateless by externalizing sessions to a shared low-latency store. Question number 157. An application load balancer fronts an e-commerce service. The operations team wants to group incoming requests by the original client IP address. Which request header should the application analyze? Option A, X-forwarded proto. Option B, X-forwarded host. Option C, X-forwarded port. Option D, X-forwarded for. The correct answer is D, X-forwarded for. Here is why. An application load balancer adds the originating client IP information to the X-forwarded for header. Why are the other options not correct? A, X-forwarded proto identifies the original request protocol. B, X-forwarded host identifies the requested host. C, X-forwarded port represents port information, not the client address. Exam tip. Applications behind an ALB use X-forwarded for to identify the original client IP. Question number 158. A monthly Lambda workflow calls an external API many times and may now run for several days. The provider returns per minute and per day rate limit information, and calls must pause until capacity becomes available. The solution should remain serverless and avoid custom scheduling infrastructure. Which refactoring is most operationally efficient? Option A, buffer every API call in SQS and rely on the function to poll at an assumed fixed rate. Option B, orchestrate the calls with a step function standard workflow and use wait states before the next Lambda invocation when the rate limit requires a delay. Option C, count calls with a CloudWatch logs metric and attempt to stop a running Lambda invocation when an alarm enters alarm. Option D, batch the requests through Amazon Data Firehose and invoke Lambda from delivered S3 objects. The correct answer is B, orchestrate the calls with a step function standard workflow and use wait states before the next Lambda invocation when the rate limit requires a delay. Here is why. A standard workflow can persist execution state for long-running processing and wait states pause without consuming Lambda execution time. Why are the other options not correct? A, SQS alone does not model dynamic minute and daily reset waits from response data. C, an alarm cannot stop and later resume a running Lambda execution safely. D, Data Firehose is a delivery service and does not orchestrate rate-limited API calls. Exam tip. Use step functions wait states for durable serverless workflows that must pause between rate-limited calls. Question number 159. Several production Lambda functions call one another and invoke downstream AWS services. The team must locate the component responsible for elevated end-to-end latency and inspect request-level faults across the distributed call path. Which service should the developer use? Option A, AWS X-ray trace segments, subsegments, and errors. Option B, AWS Cloud Trail Management Event History. Option C, Amazon Inspector Agents. Option D, uncorrelated CloudWatch log statements only. The correct answer is A, AWS X-ray trace segments, subsegments, and errors. Here is why. X-ray correlates one request across Lambda functions and downstream services, exposing latency, dependencies, faults, and errors in the distributed trace. Why are the other options not correct? B, Cloud Trail audits AWS API activity rather than application request latency. C, Inspector evaluates security exposure, not distributed performance. D, logs can help but do not automatically reconstruct the end-to-end service path. Exam tip. Use distributed traces to identify which service or downstream call contributes latency to one request. Question number 160. An elastic beanstalk production environment must retain its normal serving capacity while a new version is deployed. The deployment must avoid interruption and use fewer temporary instances than a complete replacement fleet. Which deployment policy should be selected? Option A, immutable. Option B, blue/green. Option C, all at once. Option D, rolling with additional batch. The correct answer is D, rolling with additional batch. Here is why. Elastic Beanstalk launches a temporary batch before updating existing instances, preserving full capacity with fewer extra resources than a complete new fleet. Why are the other options not correct? A, Immutable deployment creates a full replacement fleet and costs more temporarily. B. Blue/green also maintains a complete second environment. C. All at once reduces capacity to 0 during deployment. Exam tip. Rolling with additional batch preserves capacity with temporary resources equal to only one deployment batch. You have completed Part 4 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.